Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Whitaker. I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I am a complex somatic trauma specialist, which means I work with dysregulated nervous systems and skills and practices that work with neuroplasticity in the brain, so helping you develop new habits. I'm also a nonverbal communication specialist, and I myself am a neurodivergent individual. The objective of today's presentation on understanding neurodivergence is to look at neurodivergence from a different perspective. If only for a few minutes, see if you can step outside the comfort of your own point of view and see if your perspective shifts or changes at all as a result of today's presentation. And for the first part of today's presentation, we're going to go back to the basics because having a common foundational understanding of neurodivergence, well, of anything for that matter, is really important. So let's jump in. Neurodivergence is an umbrella term that refers to a multitude of neurological conditions, developmental disabilities, and mental illnesses. Some people are born with a neurodivergent condition. Some people acquire a neurodivergent condition through illness, injury, or trauma, and some people have acquired neurodivergent conditions. It's important to mention that this graphic is a living model. I created it several years ago, and it's been updated several times based on research. The jury is still out on a couple conditions that I have included, which are Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and whether they should be included as age-acquired neurodivergent conditions. Once the jury's in and that debate is settled, this graph may change again, but for now, it is what it is. It's also important to name that if you hear things like autism and neurodivergence being used interchangeably, that's technically not true. All autistic people are neurodivergent, but not all neurodivergent people are autistic. Glossaries are important, so let's take a few minutes just to go over some really important and relevant definitions. Neurodiversity refers to all humans. It's the diversity of human minds and the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. And within the human species on the planet, 20% of all humans are neurodivergent. The neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement that seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent community. Neurodivergent is a broad term that means having a mind that functions in ways that diverge from the dominant societal standard of normal or typical. And neurotypical is having a style of neurocognitive functioning that falls within that dominant societal standard. Neurodiverse refers to a group or community that includes many individuals with a range of neurological differences and variations. So a group or a collective can be neurodiverse, but an individual cannot. Neurodivergence is the state of being neurodivergent. Neuronormative is a term based on the attitude that neurotypicality is the only normal and natural means of cognition or perception, and it's considered a privileged and prejudiced attitude or perspective. Neurotype is an individual's specific type or category of brain functioning. Allistic refers to someone who is not autistic. Autistic is someone who's on the autism spectrum, and autist is a noun that can refer to an autistic individual. And then last slide of definitions, disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So it only has to be one major life activity that's limited for you to have a disability. Disabled is an adjective, and that's really important to remember. We don't want to refer to people or an individual as disabled, but you might work at a clinic that works with disabled patients. Ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. Ableism also defines people by their disability and assumes that disabled people require fixing or cures, and it is a system of oppression. And neuroableism is a specific type of ableism experienced by neurodivergent people. And ableism continues to hide in plain sight, and even the United Nations recognizes its continued pervasiveness, not just in the United States, but around the world.
What is ableism? It is a form of discrimination based on a value system that considers certain body and mind characteristics essential to living a fulfilling life, and assumes that the quality of life of people with disabilities must be very low. In ableism, like in racism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression, dominant social groups project their own image as the model for how humanity should be, rejecting or ignoring others as inferior, not normal, or unfit. This bias is used to justify their exclusion, sometimes even their extermination. One example is the eugenics movement, which emerged in the early 20th century and resulted in the forced sterilization of more than 60,000 women, men, and children with disabilities under the pretext of improving humanity's gene pool. More than 300,000 persons with disabilities were exterminated because their lives were considered unworthy. But despite the scale of these atrocities, ableism continues to spread, and its significance remains little understood. Ableist social views still shape our understanding of what it means to live with disabilities and how the lives of people with disabilities are valued. Thousands of women and girls continue to be sterilized against their will, and many more persons with disabilities spend their lives confined in institutions, prisons, or at home, and deemed to be incapable of living in the community. Ableism underpins the way our societies are organized. Basic daily activities, such as going to school or work, taking public transport, doing groceries, or practicing a hobby are made difficult, if not impossible, for persons with disabilities and end up excluded and isolated. Human rights challenge ableism and other forms of oppression and fight for a world where diversity is valued and embraced. Humanity is always changing. People everywhere use their minds and bodies in different ways, and those differences are what makes us stronger. Human diversity is all around us. We are all part of it. Let's embrace it.
Ableism manifests in a multitude of ways. The individual is likely to internalize ableism, thus resulting in infantilization or learned helplessness. Questioning or denying the disability can lead to the devaluation of the disabled person's life, thus leading to things like suicidal ideation attempts or completion. Disabled people often perceive that they have an inherent flaw that caused their disability, like laziness or I don't exercise enough. Interpersonal ableism is about relationships, and it comes in the form of microaggressions, non-consensual help, somebody jumping in, oh, let me do that for you. Inspiration porn, which is, oh, you're such an inspiration, or how wonderful that you're able to, I don't know, get on the bus and go to the grocery store or something. Mercy killings and higher rates of violence against disabled people are part of the interpersonal manifestations of ableism, because we're more likely than our neurotypical peers to be on the receiving end of robbery, sexual assault, rape, aggravated assault. And institutional manifestations mean that ableism is baked into the system. Inaccessible spaces and unaddressed barriers to inclusion are all around us. Violence against disabled people is grossly underreported, and the sheer numbers of autistic and ADHD individuals who die by police shootings is also underreported. Physical restraint, especially of non-speaking individuals or individuals with bigger stemming behaviors, or those who have cognitive motor functioning impairments, are still seen as acceptable to use in certain settings, and hiring practices and corporate policies are often ableist in nature, and there's a massive lack of investment in improving systems that will enhance the lives of disabled individuals. And the statistics show why this matters. 20%, 2 out of every 10 people you meet are neurodivergent. Now, United States specific statistics, 32% of Americans, not even a third, are able to define neurodivergence. Over half of Americans aren't sure what neurodivergence means, and approximately 1/4 of the American population either identify as neurodivergent or identify as neurotypical, but they can't define neurodivergence. So they're identifying or disidentifying with something that they don't know what it is. Sorry guys, that's the most American statistic I've run across in a while. 6% of boomers are neurodivergent. 30% of Gen Z is neurodivergent, and approximately 50% of Gen Alpha is neurodivergent. Now, I would argue that only 6% of the boomers are diagnosed as neurodivergent. I think the number who are actually neurodivergent is much larger. And why? I'm not going to get into all the reasons why the numbers are growing. A lot of it's self-awareness. We know more than we used to, but there is more neurodiversity showing up with each passing generation. Life expectancy of autistic people is only 54 years. And if there's a co-occurring cognitive disability, that plummets to 37 in comparison to 73 and 78 for the general population globally and in the US. And the last three statistics here are from Deloitte, which I think is really relevant. 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. Autistic adults are unemployed. I think I messed up on my enunciation there, sorry. Compared to only about 4.2% of the general population. Now, this is a 2022 statistic, so that general population statistic may have changed since then. Approximately 25% of CEOs are dyslexic, but they refuse to discuss it, showing that there is strength in neurodivergence, and including neurodivergent professionals can lead to 30% more productivity. And I think it's important that these statistics, the last three are from Deloitte, because Deloitte is one of the more conservative and traditional corporate institutions that you're going to find. And the simple fact that they recognize the value of neurodivergence is impactful and important in the mainstream in the world. Now let's go on to part 2. This is understanding the differences between traits and behaviors. And due to time constraints, I'm only going to cover the big 3 neurodivergent conditions today: autism, ADHD, and ADHD. But this will give you good examples on how to discern a trait from a behavior. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So it becomes easier to apply to other neurodivergent conditions as well. So first things first, let's discern what is a trait, a state, a sign, and a symptom. Traits are stable and enduring characteristics or dispositions of an individual. They're generally consistent over time, and they could be heritable or a genetic part of a personality. So if they're part of the personality, you might just be throughout your life generally calm or optimistic or anxious or ambitious. If it's genetic, it's things that we know like eye color, height, freckles, things like that. States are temporary conditions or modes of being that are influenced by circumstances. States are transient and situational, and they're often caused by external factors. So feeling anxious before a performance or executive functioning shutdowns and meltdowns, those are states because they're temporary. Fight or flight is a state. Freeze is a state. These are nervous system states. Signs are objective. This is an objective indicator of a condition that can be observed or measured by others. So things that can be measured by others include things like medical exams, tests, lab work, imaging, stimming, toe walking, things that we can observe and see and sometimes measure. Examples include visible rashes, broken bones, high blood pressure, repetitive movements. These are all things that we can witness. Symptoms are subjective, and they're experiences that are felt and reported by the individual. They're perceived and described only by the person experiencing, and they cannot be directly observed by others. So symptoms include things like pain, nausea, fatigue, anxiety, headaches, oversensitivity to lights or sounds or some other stimuli, differences in social interaction and communication. And so this is why it's really important to believe people when they share their experiences. Now, what you're looking at is what's referred to as the window of tolerance. And notice that it has both an upper and a lower boundary. Those boundaries are a little bit like the paper tray in your printer. They can narrow or widen depending on your emotional state each day. When we're in our window of tolerance, it feels flowy. We can be some version of our best selves, meeting life's ups and downs. And so life might get a little frustrating or irritating, but we can move through those moments as some version of our best selves when we're in our window of tolerance. Sometimes people get bumped out. Getting bumped high is associated with hyperarousal, which is our fight or flight. And so some of these descriptors might be what you experience if you're in a fight or flight. And sometimes, if you're a neurodivergent individual, you can find yourself in fight or flight because of overstimulation. And sometimes people from the outside look at us and they think they're seeing signs of a temper tantrum. But what we are experiencing inside ourselves are symptoms of a meltdown. And there are massive differences between tantrums, meltdowns, and shutdowns. Meltdowns are associated more closely with fight or flight. Now, tantrums are acting out behaviors that are exhibited when a person, often a young child, isn't getting their way. They involve deliberate, goal-oriented outbursts of behavior that cease when the desired outcome, object, or attention is achieved. Tantrums are driven by frustration and a sense of entitlement to the desired outcome. They're often triggered by being told no. But meltdowns and shutdowns, on the other hand, are involuntary, and they have very different triggers, and they do not cease when a desired outcome is achieved. There's usually a recovery period following meltdowns and shutdowns, but there's not with a tantrum. Meltdowns are associated with overstimulation from excess sensory stimulation, and they align with fight or flight responses. They're involuntary, and they happen when the individual has reached their limit for coping. Recovery from a meltdown generally varies from minutes to hours to days. Shutdowns are associated with being bumped low, which is hypoarousal, or that freeze and dissociative response. And these are some of the descriptors that you might use if you're in hypoarousal or in a shutdown. So shutdowns tend to be less obvious than meltdowns, and they align more, like I said, with the freeze response. They might follow a meltdown. So somebody might plunge from a meltdown and just plummet into a shutdown, or they might happen in isolation. Shutdowns are an involuntary protective mechanism in which the individual internally shuts down due to feeling overwhelmed by a world that's just too much for too long. From the outside, what prompts a shutdown might appear to be a minor or insignificant incident, but it's actually the culmination of stress that has quietly built up over a period of time. And during a shutdown, the individual might experience situational mutism, and they're not able to communicate their needs. They might have a regression of skills, or skills are temporarily lost. Shutdowns tend to last longer than meltdowns. But what meltdowns and shutdowns have in common is the recovery period tends to last from, several minutes to several hours to several days. And in extreme cases, it could be weeks. Tantrums tend to end pretty quickly. So even though from the outside looking in, they can all look very similar behavior-wise from the outside, please know that what's happening on the inside can be very, very different. Autism is a spectrum doesn't mean what you think. This is one of my favorite articles, and this was life-changing for me. A lot of people think that the spectrum looks like this, but this is not actually a spectrum. What you're looking at here, from a little quirky to definitely autistic to tragically autistic, this is a gradient, and that's not what the spectrum actually is. The spectrum looks more like this in reality, where you have a spectrum, a rainbow. A rainbow is comprised of 7 different colors of the rainbow, and each color is associated, to help explain this, with a different trait. Now, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual often focuses on behaviors and not traits. So if you look at this through the lens of traits, we have pragmatic language, which includes body language, eye contact, small talk, turn-taking, and conversation. Eye contact is highlighted in the DSM, but that's a behavior that falls under this trait. Social awareness is picking up on etiquette, social norms, taboos, the ability to form and maintain relationships. Again, some of the things that fall under the traits are behaviors, not the actual traits. And I am going to talk about the DSM a little bit more in depth, and I'm going to sprinkle it in as I go along. So just know that a lot of the DSM criteria focuses on behaviors, not traits. And that is a problem within the neurodivergent community. Another trait is monotropic mindset, which is our special interests and the ability to hyperfocus falls here. Information processing is assimilating and applying new information quickly or adapting to new environments and situations. Sensory processing is another trait. A lot of autistic individuals have challenges interpreting sensory information, and you'll see a variance sometimes from hypersensitivity to hyposensitivity. So there's quite a range of sensory processing in autism. Repetitive behaviors, stemming is a behavior. I would also argue that echolalia is a repetitive behavior, and even eating some of the same foods over and over again and having those consistent routines would fall under repetitive behaviors. And neuromotor differences, the ability to control our bodily movements, and it can range from a little clumsy and quirky all the way up to a loss of ability to move with conscious intention. Now, each autistic person is affected strongly enough in one or more of these categories for it to be disabling in some way, but each person's dominant color palette may look different. And so this is why saying that we're all a little autistic is incorrect, because you might have a sensory processing disorder, and sensory processing is one of the traits of autism. But if you're not affected in most of these categories, you're not autistic. You really have to have the spectrum of traits, not just one for it to be autism. And so here are some examples of how autism could manifest in 3 different people. So let's just look at the trait of pragmatic language. Person 1 tends to miss subtle social cues, tends to interrupt, or accidentally bores people. Person 2 is unable to speak due to motor problems, but they're really good at picking up on social cues, and they're good at understanding subtle body language. Whereas person 3 doesn't notice when others are upset, and they need communication to be clear, unambiguous, no metaphor, like say what you mean and mean what you say. So I encourage you to circle back to this article and go through this with a fine-tooth comb, especially if you are directly or indirectly impacted by autism. This is a really valuable article. And just to put these color palettes, the same 3 color palettes we just saw, side by side with the new DSM diagnostic criteria that puts it in this diagnostic wheel, again, you see 7 different traits listed, but over here you see stemming. Stemming is a behavior. You see meltdowns. Meltdowns are behaviors. You see eye contact. Eye contact is one of those things that it can, for some people, be a behavior, and for other people, it could be a trait. Anxiety leads to behaviors. So again, the DSM still focuses a lot on behaviors, and it's a mixture of traits and distress symptoms. And distress symptoms or distress signs are behaviors. And this focuses on traits where the behaviors fall under the different traits. Now, moving on to ADHD. ADHD is another condition that is a cognitive difference. It's a different neurotype. It's not a behavior disorder. And there tend to be 6 main areas of executive functioning that are affected the most by ADHD. Activation, which includes organizing, estimating time, prioritizing, getting started with a project. Focus, sustaining or shifting focus. Effort, regulating alertness, sustaining effort and processing speed. Emotion, managing and modulating our emotions, and managing frustration is especially hard for ADHDers, or a lot of them. Memory, using working memory and accessing recall, and then action, monitoring and regulating self-action. Now, like autism, like I said, ADHD is better known by the behaviors exhibited under stress than the traits of the condition. And you can see some of those common distress symptoms or signs of ADHD. These are behaviors that we're all very familiar with. But the left-hand column covers some of the innate traits of ADHD. Neural hyperconnectivity means there is increased activity and stronger connections between specific brain regions rather than the more balanced connectivity seen in neurotypical brain scans. Neural holotopic sensory gating means the individual is less able to filter out sensory information and is neurologically more receptive to external stimuli. ADHD brains have a neuroceptive need that drives individuals to constantly seek new, different, and stimulating experiences rather than following predictable tasks and routines. Monotropism refers to the individual's ability to hyperfocus intensely for prolonged periods of time. And the interest-driven dopamine system means that the ADHD brain is motivated by tasks that provide dopamine through novelty, challenge, urgency, and interest. Bottom-up processing is driven by sensory input, and top-down processing is guided by internal goals and knowledge. So individuals with ADHD are less likely to be motivated by external pressure, and the more pressure or demands placed on them to do better, be better, act differently by friends, family, teachers, doctors, etc., and so on, the more likely they are to become disconnected, angry, and shut down. And rejection-sensitive dysphoria is characterized by strong emotional reactions that have been described as immense emotional pain from real or perceived failure to meet others' expectations. Reactions can be internalized, like intense, unbearable feelings of low self-esteem and self-criticism, or they can be externalized, like responding to someone with anger or bursting into tears. RSD is closely associated with ADHD, and some experts believe it's one of the defining components of the condition. So RSD is considered an overarching trait of ADHD that's important. But that point is still under debate. It is an overlooked symptom of complex PTSD, autism, and adoption, just to name a few. And there are several causes of RSD: conditioned rejection, emotional regulation challenges, being constantly criticized, humiliated, or embarrassed, disappointing or letting down a loved one. So when we mess up, we can activate our own RSD symptoms. Justice sensitivity. So just seeing injustice in the world is really hard, and it can keep us in a state of activated RSD. And interoception difficulties. Interoception is the ability to sense and feel into the body and for the brain to receive and interpret the sensory signals sent from the body up to the brain. And one of the most common coping mechanisms to avoid rejection is people pleasing. Now, this slide is really important because ADHD is a condition that needs help and support. When left unchecked, childhood symptoms could lead to detrimental and even tragic circumstances in adulthood. So you can see that like poor performance in school can lead to under or unemployment in adulthood. Like that clumsiness or multiple injuries in childhood can become risk-taking or the adrenaline junkie in adulthood. Drug and alcohol experimentation could become alcohol or substance use disorders. Difficulty with emotional regulation can become involvement in illegal conduct or antisocial behaviors, and a repetitive failure to succeed and please others can become hopelessness, frustration, and resignation. And this matters because lives depend on it. Undiagnosed, untreated, and unsupported AD, especially when it occurs in BIPOC or LGBTQ children or otherwise marginalized individuals in childhood, that can very quickly become the fuel that perpetuates and drives the school to prison pipeline. And then autism. It is widely believed that a co-occurrence of autism and ADHD simply means you have the condition that is colloquially referred to as ADHD. ADHD is an unofficial and popular term within the neurodivergent community, but it is currently not an official diagnosis. Prior to 2013, autism and ADHD were considered mutually exclusive conditions. And at one point in history, it was believed that autism and ADHD could not coexist in the same individual. You were one or the other, but not both. But we've learned that that's not true. There was no research into ADHD as a co-occurring condition prior to 2013, and ADHDers are more likely to be misdiagnosed because they do not meet typical presentations of either autism or ADHD, and coexisting traits are often contradictory. So there can be hyperfocus, but also hyperattention. Hyperattention refers to multitasking, and ADHDers are probably the best at multitasking of any group out there, where shifting attention from this to this to this especially if you're hyper focused, you might be able to shift between 2 or 3 things that really interest you at the same time versus being told what to focus on. There can be attention to detail, but prone to mistakes. Thriving when there's a set routine, but struggling to plan and follow a schedule. So all of these contradictions can lead to that internal conflict and self-esteem and self-worth issues because we have a hard time coming to terms with some of these contradictory traits. But it turns out that autism and ADHD do not equal ADHD. I'm not a neuroscientist, so bear with me for a minute as I give a very rudimentary explanation here. So the first column, A, is autism, B is ADHD, and C is ADHD. So these are brain scans. The results of these 2 studies, Bedford and Berg, the 2 studies, both came out in 2023, and they were looking at distinct cortical differences in autism and ADHD that are differentially impacted by age, sex, and potentially unique patterns related to their co-occurrence. So the images that you see, A, B, and C, show that there are differences in cortical thickness and surface area, literal structural differences in the brain, in various regions of the brain among all 3 conditions. And if you look at A and B and C, I can just eyeball this and see that the areas lit up in the A scans and the areas lit up in the B scans are not the same areas if you were just to do a simple overlay in the C scans. And same thing here in the charts. Again, if you look at the little scans here and look at the boxes that are highlighted, different areas are coming up. So if you look at C and F, this is ADHD. So these studies are indicating that ADHD is its own condition altogether because there are enough areas in the brain that are affected, different areas of the brain that are affected, that indicate it's not a simple co-occurrence. And these studies also found that sex modulates the neuroanatomy of autism, but not ADHD. So what that means is you're going to see vast differences in female presentations of autism and male presentations of autism, but ADHD, the presentations for male to female are going to be similar in terms of traits and behaviors. So more research needs to be done on individuals with co-occurring conditions like autism and ADHD to confirm these preliminary findings. But this is pointing to ADHD being its own condition altogether. And now let's move on to part 3. The final part in today's presentation, where we're going to look at biases, because these biases are things that we all need to overcome for more inclusiveness of not just neurodivergent, but other marginalized communities as well, because a lot of other communities are dealing with the same biases, but these are definitely specific to neurodiversity and some of the bigger ones. So one overarching bias disabled individuals too frequently experience is the strengths and needs bias. Strengths hide needs and needs hide strengths. Being well-educated, intelligent, and high-achieving doesn't mean I'm autism-free and I have no need for help or no need for accommodations. Nor does it mean being a non-speaking or semi-speaking autistic individual. It doesn't mean that they have nothing to offer the world or no value. So this bias circles back to the influence of eugenics and ableism that still hides in plain sight. Now these 2 studies the 2 studies that I've cited here focused on clinicians, but they were looking at if clinicians are still impacted by their society, and they very much are. It's safe to extrapolate this data to the general population, and it's disturbing that clinicians haven't unlearned these biases yet. So healthcare providers were not always able to combine professional knowledge of the autism spectrum with a social impression of a verbal, well-educated patient. So they would look at a verbal, well-educated patient as more of a neurotypical and treat them as such and refuse accommodations. And if this is happening with clinicians or doctors who are well-educated with medical degrees, this is absolutely happening within the general population. And any practical adjustments must also be accompanied by education of healthcare professionals about the specific needs of autistic patients and excess morbidity and mortality associated with not meeting these needs in ways in which the practice changes can benefit autistic patients. So I know we can't control all of the systemic issues, but there are certain steps we can take that are within our control. And to be responsible allies, it's important to realize when we are projecting a bias that somebody is too strong to have needs or too needy to have strengths. The DSM criteria, as I've mentioned, for both autism and ADHD include more distress behaviors than innate traits, contributing to the confusion around what ADHD and autism neurotypes really are. So whether you know it or not, you are more influenced by the DSM than you may realize. If you sit down at your computer and go to a search engine and search what is autism, what is ADHD, what is ADHD, you're going to get hits from sites like WebMD, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, the CDC, Autism Speaks, National Institutes of Health, on and on and on. All organizations that are heavily influenced by the medical model, also known as the pathologizing model, because it homes in on distress behaviors rather than inherent traits. And all of these organizations are heavily influenced by corporate interests. And so that's why the DSM bias is really important to be aware of. A lot of the diagnostic criteria are largely based, especially for autism, on Western male-centric middle-class norms and Western male-centric middle-class presentations of the conditions. So cultural norms are pathologized, disproportionately affecting non-Western cultures. Gender bias is skewed against women, especially in the diagnosis of autism and ADHD. Hormones and hormonal changes that we go through in life can either mask or suppress or highlight different conditions. As I get older, my ADHD symptoms are starting to take over and suppress my autism symptoms. That didn't happen when I was younger and before I went through menopause. Historically, moral and social perspectives have played a bigger role than science. So, for example, homosexuality at one point was considered a mental disorder. We know that's not true. And for some disorders, such as autism, the diagnostic roots go all the way back to the eugenics movement and the Nazi regime. And a significant majority, almost 70% of the DSM panel, the people who decide what goes in the DSM, have reported financial ties to pharmaceutical companies, including research funding, consultancies, and speakers bureaus. That's largely concerning because corporate interests have more say in the diagnostic criteria than actual science. Then there's such thing as a professionalism bias. So I got this image here from LinkedIn where it says, if your definition of professionalism requires everyone to present, communicate, or work in the same way, it's not professionalism, it's exclusion dressed up in a suit. And I hope you'll sit and think about that for a minute because it's true. Professionalism bias is often inflexible in terms of productivity standards or what's expected in terms of productivity standards, assuming that neurodivergent people are incompetent or ignoring that there's an invisible disability altogether. Rigid time and on-site work policies are considered professional, like you have to come to the office. Well, some neurodivergent people do their best productive work in the middle of the night and tend to sleep when it's daytime out. That doesn't mean they have nothing valuable to add. Is it possible that they could work from home on their own time? Mislabeling signs and symptoms as attitude is a problem. And this is context dependent because certain jobs require a specific dress code. Like you're not going to wear your jeans if you're a firefighter, but dress code policing in some contexts is a professionalism bias. Professionalism often outright ignores accommodation requests. And while we're talking about professionalism, I want to take just a moment to mention the font that I've used today. The font that you're seeing throughout this presentation is Open Dyslexic font. And the font that's used in a lot of printed materials is not considered professional, especially if it's a font that's easy to read for a dyslexic person. So back in the day when word processors were new and we only had a handful of fonts to choose from, Comic Sans took a lot of crap. But from those original fonts, Comic Sans font was the most easily readable for dyslexic people. So that early professionalism bias left a lot of dyslexic people in the dust in favor of Times New Roman, which is much harder to read. Open Dyslexic is free for download, and where this is valuable is the P's, the B's, the Q's, the G's. Like if you transpose or flip letters, they're not the same. So it makes it easier to read for dyslexic people. Microaggressions are implicit, subcortical, unconscious transgressions in the form of words or actions that occur where stigma or power imbalances exist between groups. And due to their subtle, ever-present, ambiguous, and deniable essence, microaggressions are particularly harmful for individuals on the receiving end of them. Now, this image here is artwork by Satya. This is a portrait where she's used mixed media to adapt a portrait, and she has a whole series called 1,000 Cuts. And this is one of the paintings called Statue from her Death by 1,000 Cuts series. And this is what microaggressions feel like. There are three main types of microaggressions: microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidations. Microinvalidations are the microaggression that neurodivergent people are most likely to be on the receiving end of. If there's intersectionality, so let's say you're LGBTQ, BIPOC, and neurodivergent, you're likely to be on the receiving end of all three types of microaggressions. And microaggressions sound a lot like some of the things you see surrounding this boy. Oh, this is ridiculous. What's your deal? Quit being shy. Do you want me to use sign language? Why don't you just talk? Like, why are you so lazy? Everybody's a little autistic. We're all a little bit ADHD. You're such a creep. You're so weird. It gets to the point that we are micro-invalidated to the point that we not only micro-invalidate ourselves, we macro-invalidate ourselves, and microaggressions often underlie our self-hatred and suicidal tendencies or suicidal ideation. And then I call this the why can't you just buy it? Because it works for me, so it will work for thee. It's kind of like the king making a declaration. And this is a bias in which one person projects their own experiences, routines, approaches, or thoughts or processes onto another. And it's an oversimplification bias that originates from too little empathy, compassion, and understanding. And this is a combination of several different biases. So the fundamental attribution error is a cognitive bias where people overemphasize personality or character-based explanations for others' behavior while underestimating situational influences. So this leads to judging others really harshly. So blaming a coworker's lateness on laziness rather than a car accident and they got stuck in traffic, or dismissing a meltdown or executive functioning shutdown as a mere temper tantrum. Limited perspective bias is the human tendency to overemphasize your own viewpoint, experiences, or knowledge while acting as if this narrow individual perspective is complete for everybody. So it leads to poor egocentric decision-making, particularly in complex, high-stakes environments. It reduces empathy and increases defensiveness and causes individuals to misjudge situations by ignoring outside perspectives. Confirmation bias is the unintentional tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information that supports one pre-existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. This leads to skewed decision-making, reinforced stereotypes, and damaged relationships by focusing on negative self-confirming details. And then binary bias, which is also known as the disregard for nuance bias. This is the cognitive tendency to oversimplify complex issues into black or white, us versus them, good versus bad, zero-sum game categories, bypassing critical thinking. And it stems from mental shortcuts, sometimes called heuristics, that favor efficiency over complexity, leading to flawed decision-making, increased polarization, and the reinforcement of stereotypes. And last slide, before we get into the final slides, I just want to give a heads up. A lot of times the final slides, people want to take pictures. So now's the time to get your phones out and get your phones and cameras ready if you want to take screenshots of the final slides. So the last one is thin slice judgments bias. Thin slice judgments are those first impressions, and they have become a long-lasting part of our perceptions and attitudes if we are not aware and consciously aware that we make thin slice judgments. So Research has demonstrated that after only a couple seconds of seeing an autistic person, non-autistic people have a negative reaction to them. So people rate autistic people as less trustworthy, less attractive, less smart, less likable, less dominant. So it's important to notice when we're making these thin slice judgments, what they might sound like in your head. If you're looking at someone as, ooh, what a creep or weirdo, or surprisingly enough, surveys have shown up that it shows up as school shooter, rapist, or stalker, like literal crimes. We get labeled as criminals just because of how we look. So if you want to learn more, these are some recommended resources. ADA is a great place where I found some good information on ADHD. ADHD Love is a YouTube channel where the wife has ADHD, and for the longest time, it was helping people understand ADHD. Her husband has very recently been diagnosed with autism, so they've expanded to where you're getting a lot of information about the differences between ADHD and autism. Neuroclastic is the autism spectrum according to autistic people. I highly recommend. This is where autism is a spectrum isn't what you think. That's where you'll find that article, as well as Autism 101 resources. Embrace Autism includes information on both autism and ADHD. Kaylin Partlow is one of my favorite YouTube channels. She is an autistic therapist, an autistic individual, and an author, and I love her YouTube channel. She refers to herself sometimes as the most hated autistic person on the internet because she gets a lot of flack and a lot of hate coming at her because she will stand up and talk about controversial topics that a lot of us don't want to do in public. And then ADHD Hub is a YouTube channel about better understanding ADHD. A lot of these are anecdotal, but if you can look at the anecdote and then take it and overlay it with the research, you're going to get a bigger picture. Now, references, if any of you are interested in looking at the two studies on ADHD that point to it being its own condition, that's Bedford and Berg. And if you're like me and you like to go through references and read them yourself, take a snapshot. Here's page 2 of references. I'll stay here for a few seconds to give you time to take a snapshot. Again, if you're someone who wants to go through the references. And final page, same thing. I'll stay here for just a few seconds to give you time to take a snapshot. And finally, thank you. Thank you for your time today. Here's my contact information, just in case any of you have questions, comments, or want to reach out. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I hope to hear from